On today's World Insight, trade and military dialogue between China and the U.S. Can these talks halt accelerating tensions? And a former U.S. ambassador on music diplomacy between China and the U.S. Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. In recent weeks, relations between China and the U.S. are becoming increasingly tense, and that is no secret. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has unveiled a U.S. plan dubbed the Clean Network to crack down the so-called Chinese apps and services. Trump signed an executive order barring transactions with TikTok and WeChat. Meanwhile, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar went to Taiwan for the highest-ranking visit by a U.S. official in decades, and it is believed to be the test of China's bottom line. Despite the conflict, there was communication going on between the two sides, even though quite limited. Chinese Minister of National Defense on Thursday took a phone call from his U.S. counterpart. The two sides exchanged views on bilateral ties and military relations. Will this tit-for-tat become the theme of China-U.S. relations, or there will be, likely in the next few months, something much more strategic and something for the much longer term? Let's ask our panelists. For more on China-U.S. ties with all the latest development, we have Professor Shending Li in Shanghai, professor from the Institute of International Studies from Fudan University. Meanwhile, joining us in Los Angeles in the U.S., Jonathan Pollack, non-resident senior fellow from the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the John Thornton China Center with the Brookings Institution. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
A lot to cover for the latest about China-U.S. relations. Daily drama going on. Mr. Pollack, how are you trying to keep up with all what's happening every day?
Tian Wei, I have not encountered a period like this in relations between the U.S. and China that remotely resembles anything in the past. It is a day-to-day activity. What I can say is that the Trump administration seems on issue after issue prepared to push and to prod, and in many cases, frankly, to disrupt, without it being at all clear what the final or ultimate rationale of this activity might be. Now, I also try to follow developments out of China, read the recent interviews given by senior officials. It seems to me that what China is trying its best to do is to limit the damage, almost to stanch the blood flow that has been created between the two countries, and hope that once the election process is over, that we might see the return to something that looks more like a semblance of a normal relationship, although great damage has been done in the interim.
Professor Shen, once again, I talked to you after a few days ago. At that time, you were talking about criticism and self-criticism, China and United States, when they try to deal with one another, possibly. But new development, Taiwan, China's bottom line. What about that?
President Xi Jinping used to speak about beating, fighting, struggling, but he finally stated how to beat in an artistic way. 斗争要讲艺术. So this time, we should not follow the U.S. When the U.S. throw a stone against China, U.S. inevitably would create a collateral damage upon the U.S. And when we beat America, because China-U.S. are deeply intertwined, inevitably we would generate a collateral damage upon ourselves. How to limit the self-inflicted damage and also prepare for some leeway for America is what our leadership recently has been indicating. So Wang Yi has stated we should do firmness and rationality, and proposed for 3 lists of dialogue. Vice Premier Liu He is going to have a dialogue with his trade counterpart in the U.S. U.S. Defense Secretary has just had a phone call with Chinese counterpart Wei Fenghe, and the U.S. Secretary proposed to visit China later this year. This would constitute another dialogue. When we firmly criticize the U.S., we should also appreciate we are not having zero dialogue. We are planning for more and more dialogue on trade, on defense, and possibly covering South China Sea. Also, Wang Yi has stated the South China Sea is the happy courtyard, our common prosperity space for all countries in South China Sea region. That certainly suits some of those concerns of these ring South China Sea countries, and probably make America feel a little more east. So these are all China's artistic, balanced diplomacy these days, beating Americans, pushing envelope against China.
Both of you talk about frameworks and talk about daily drama. The Chinese side has been proposing all of the above, as Professor Shen just said. So, Mr. Pollack, takes 2 to tango. That's just a rule that we know in diplomacy. The question really is, that, when there's rules of the tango, will Washington interested in it? If not, what's next?
Well, I think we have to put this to some extent in the context of the impending U.S. presidential election. President Trump believes that escalating differences with China, shutting down doors, constraining dialogue, undertaking unilateral actions in a whole host of areas will be to his political advantage. That remains to be seen. As we all know, he is lagging very, very badly in the polls right now, but somehow he and some of his advisors think that the best approach right now is to raise voices about China, make cooperation, except in a few very precise areas, more and more difficult in the remaining time of his current term of office.
As both of you said, that there has been a lengthy interview given by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, which he said, we have proposed that the 2 countries, China-U.S., draw up 3 lists of respectively on cooperation, dialogue, and issues that need proper management, and draw up a roadmap for future interactions. Our message is quite clear, he said. We urge the U.S. to stop acting with arrogance and prejudice, very diplomatic words from the Chinese way, but enter into constructive dialogue, this is an important message, with us on an equal footing. Now, Professor Shen, no doubt sending Secretary Azar to Taiwan is to provoke China's bottom line and testing the water as to how much Washington can go. The more being provoked China is, the more likely who sent him to Washington will be more satisfied. But at the same time, China said very clearly for decades, Taiwan is the bottom line. So China is in a dilemma, apparently from others see China. What to do about Taiwan?
Well, I agree that the Secretary Azar's visit to Taiwan is a very serious issue touching China's bottom line. We rolled out those most challenging time under the older President Bush. And under President Clinton, the 2 countries also had lots of unhappy happening, but we survived. So I think there is great hope. We could still survive Azar's visit.
Mr. Pollack, if I understand what Professor Shen is trying to say, underlining, we had worse times, and it seemed that we survived. And meanwhile, if politics didn't work, there are other fronts that will work, even though that would take much more effort. Did you hear his message? Is that the logic?
Well,
what is the logic to you?
No, it was, but I think that there is one difference. Under George H.W. Bush and under Bill Clinton, you had presidents who were very mindful of the risks. They were taking actions in terms of weapon sales and the like that they felt obligated to undertake, but they did not want to see a larger breakdown in the bilateral relationship and took significant steps to try to prevent that, looking for where there were opportunities for cooperation between the United States and China of a very, very meaningful sort. We don't have the time to go through all that history right now. The difference now would be whether or not Mr. Trump has that kind of an attitude. As we all know, he is a very, how should we say, idiosyncratic leader. He acts on impulse. He does what he wants to do. He often may say things privately, but what he said does publicly or claims he will do publicly can be very different. Because I think one way or another, in order to restore or sustain a productive relationship will require, as you noted, a very constructive, determined attitude and a commitment of time and energy and political resources on both sides.
There are a lot of things going on these days, but there are also different voices, even though they might not necessarily that much reported. Pompeo's hawkish stand toward China is not without critics in the U.S. either. In regards to the clean network policy, tech reporter Sam Biddle writes recently, the State Department has a new vision for a clean internet, and this clean has a quote there, by which it means a China-free internet. Of course, there's a lot of temper in these sentences, but one could see one issue which is extremely important. Mr. Pollack, this is not just about two countries' relations. This is also about principles with which we run our countries and principles with which countries are dealing with each other and principles with which the world is being governed collectively. So if the U.S. try to take out China by bending all the important principles and values the U.S. have been taking pride in promoting or at least preaching for decades, will the U.S. think about the long-term, even mid-term consequences? And will the U.S. still be a leader? If the U.S. fail to be a leader, what will be the collateral damage? Those are, even though longer term than 4 months, but those could also be imminent. One could see it reflected in so many issues every day around the world.
As we know, politicians need to think beyond what they might calculate as their political advantage in a given moment. Actions have consequences. And this effort to separate China, the so-called splintering of the internet, strikes me as delusional. I'm not a technical specialist, but to somehow try to think you can find a way to keep China out of that process, or alternatively to see the creation of two global internets, it strikes me almost as utter madness. But it's this belief that in this highly charged atmosphere, where frankly I cannot identify, with the possible exception of Secretary Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury, anyone at the upper levels of the United States government who is giving Trump any contrary advice. So these actions, these statements, these threats can do enormous damage, even in the near term. And frankly, it then becomes a question of how China chooses to respond or not respond to these developments. For now, it seems to me China has tried to limit the damage where it can. Many of the leaders in China are probably a little shocked about how you try to deal with a country like the United States under these circumstances. Many Americans are shocked, myself included. So maybe the thought is that there's a way simply to wait out this presidency. But as we all know, the accomplishments, it's kind of like cutting down a forest. It's much easier to cut down a forest than it is to grow the trees. And so much is at risk right now. Yet, when you listen to the voices coming from the Trump administration, it is almost as if these are cost-free to the United States and to the world. That, to me, is a lack of awareness.
Two things I want to mention, particularly because they are extremely crucial. One is the possible upcoming dialogue or discussion, at least, between Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and his American counterpart. Meanwhile, there's another visit likely to happen between the military side of the two countries. So let's focus on them individually. Professor Shen, no secret, before any real consultation about trade issue, China is being put into this maximum pressure cooker so that the U.S. side could gain more ground. And that maximum pressure cooker could include all the cards that the U.S. considers it has about China. So Professor, tell me more about what's likely to happen with that discussion, and what does that mean?
Well, on January 15th, the two countries cut a paper, what is termed as the agreement of the first phase China-U.S. economic and trade cooperation. Some would view this as a China's concession by buying some $100 billion US equivalent of goods and services this year and next year for 2 years respectively from U.S., in addition to what we have already bought from the level of last year. Some consider that this dramatic increase of China's purchase from the U.S. is a concession. No, I don't think so. I think this is win-win. This is not China wins 2 times and U.S. wins nothing. Why buy more? China would win. Because anyway, China would buy from the globe. China has imported some 1.8 trillion US dollar equivalent goods a year or 2 years ago. So anyway, China would buy. Why not to buy 100 billion from additional more from the US? And that does not mean we should cut what we have already bought from Australia and other countries. We could increase the overall buying and import from the U.S. as President Xi Jinping has stated in his bore-out speech. He said, China's foreign trade does not pursue an objective of net increase of our surplus. We have surplus, but it's not our aim to pursue a net increase of surplus. When an annual China's net surplus of trade at the level of 400 billion US dollar, China has deep room to buy more from any country, including from America. So in my view, it's not a China concession, it's what China should do. With or without US pressure, with or without China-U.S. trade talk for 2 years, China need to do it. So it's absolute China's win. Of course, it's not a U.S. lose. So given this, Liu He should happily meet with his U.S. counterparts to say, we would win more by honoring our words. And the U.S. say, we would not lose more if you would honor.
About trade discussions likely to happen later this month. Mr. Polak?
As we know, nothing matters more to President Trump than trade imbalances and the like. And it may be that Lighthizer, although I do not in any way agree with his approach to trade. He's very much a protectionist. That's just what he's always done in his whole career. One thing we have not mentioned here is the profound disruption of the global economy because of COVID-19. And that's one of the reasons why, even if China might wish to buy much more, if it so decides, the whole context of international trade is now under extreme pressure. So Trump is looking for some kind of a gain that he figures he can get through the discussions between Liu and Lighthizer. And there may be something. I'm not privy to what exactly will be under discussion. But I don't think the targets in the Phase 1 deal were at all realistic. And they are even less realistic, frankly, under the circumstances that we now face in the international economy because of COVID-19. So it's better that they meet and talk and try to see what kind of an agreement they could come to, in part because Trump wants to believe that he's reaching some kind of an outcome that he can live with and advertise, if you will, as he prepares for the election.
Professor Shen, do you think China would accept if the U.S. walk away from the trade deal Phase 1? After all, that was done with enormous amount of efforts.
Naturally, to what some of the press has reported, in the first phase agreement, China may have agreed to import additional 34 billion equivalent of U.S. Agricultural products. This may not be precise. This is press data. If China were to do, despite China's challenges, this COVID year, and we have lots of domestic economic restraint, but if China were to still honor its word, that is an assurance China abide by its word. China means what it says. And China does not intervene into the U.S. Domestic politics. But if more a farmer would get their pay, would be more rich, probably some of them would swing to the Trump side. This would eventually be beneficial to Trump, even though we do not intend to support either of the U.S. presidential candidates. So Trump, I would say, definitely care China-U.S. would cooperate in this area.
Right. We don't want to intervene into anybody's internal affairs. However, the two governments has to still work together, at least on something. Of course, we don't want that to compromise any of the election results going on in the United States, but they have their politics to take care of. We cannot fix things that they can't fix, even internally. So that's the issue here. Having said that, though, Mr. Polak, another thing about defense ministers meeting, if they're going to meet later this year. How much concrete do you think the two sides could discuss? And it seems that the military is playing an evolvingly significant role. Some wonder whether it's only part of the so-called Trump card. Others wonder whether the militaries now are the fundamentals, together with trade and diplomacy, making the relationship stable, particularly when some of the other factors didn't work in that three columns.
Well, two things I would say here. First of all, diplomacy, as conventionally understood, requires, as you said before, both sides to tango. I see no evidence coming from the United States side is that the U.S., even in the next several months, is seriously intent on credible diplomatic interaction with China. I just don't see it. I would be very pleasantly surprised if something emerges, but I don't see it. The defense side is, I think, a healthy development, potentially a very useful development. There has to be a set of discussions that limit the risks of conflict. I don't think either country desires armed conflict, but as we know, the U.S. has been very, very active in the South China Sea and in other locations. There need to be rules of the road here that we've long talked about from time to time with China, but never to a fully satisfactory resolution. I think they're very, very necessary right now. There just needs to be clarity here on China's goals, on America's goals, because any outbreak of some kind of a conflict, even if it's seemingly very small, would be potentially an unparalleled disaster for our relations with one another and for East Asia and beyond as a whole.
Will that be an occasion that the U.S. defense side is trying to come to a dialogue with China and collect all the lower hanging fruits that they have desired for long?
I think America is preparing constantly to have some nasty things happen in the region. But they also want to have the preventive defense to coerce others, to deter others, and also in order not to have the nasty things from happening. So they need to meet with Chinese side and meet with the Russian side in order to exchange views on several issues. How to work together to sustain the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. With a broken relation between South and North Korea, how China-U.S. could still make their own effort to assure North Korea would continue to put a self-restraint, not to test long-range ballistic missile, not to undertake any nuclear blasting. This is a common interest. And Iran. And Iran has not withdrawn from JCPOA, and it has a plan to withdraw. It is a 3-stage, and it has not gone to the last stage. U.S. is not paying any contribution to it. It is other 5 power, other P4 plus Germany, staying with the remaining JCPOA, doing some legitimate trade, including energy trade, in order to assure Iran that their rights is still being respected by the rest of us. So you guys need not to withdraw from JCPOA. That provides us with certain predictability that Iran is still not nuclearized. So despite we have fundamental difference, but we have also, in my view, no less agreement than disagreement. So even we cannot cut any paper, discuss when the next U.S. espionage plan would come to this region, how China would send a signal.
Okay.
I think the Defense Secretary should have rich substance at this crucial year to discuss with his Chinese counterparts, as this would really serve a purpose of preventive defense, not a coercive defense.
All right. I learned a lot. It's fascinating, all the changes, but at the same time challenging. Luckily, we have brilliant minds like you help us to understand all the latest and look further beyond the surface. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for doing that. Professor Shending Li in Shanghai, Jonathan Pollack in Los Angeles. Thank you. Be safe.